Animals are incredible, from the bite force of a crocodile to the speed of a cheetah. The thing is, every animal has one major weakness. They eat food, and food costs money. But that's where I come in. Today, I'm gonna help these animals overcome their weaknesses by creating a zoo that doesn't feed any of its animals even once in Planet Zoo. Can I make $100,000 before getting shut down by protesters or bankruptcy? Join me to find out. For my first attempt at this, I decided to put my zoo in the desert. My thinking was animals that live in the desert probably don't need much food or something like that, so if I put desert animals in a zoo with no food, they probably won't care. Pretty big brain stuff. I laid down the paths and hired a few staff members. Notably, I couldn't hire a vet or an animal keeper since both of them will automatically feed the animals. As you may have guessed, not hiring two of the most important staff members in a zoo will have some repercussions later on, but it'll be fine. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I also began planning where my animal exhibits would go. I settled on having 3 exhibits and each would house one type of animal. Once my animals start starving to death, they're gonna attract protesters, so I thought only having a few animals would help the zoo operate semi-normally. I chose to have cheetahs, tortoises, and hyenas, since I thought they might all be able to survive for a while without food. I also put up plenty of no feeding signs in case some unruly guests got any funny ideas. I made each exhibit extremely large and surrounded them with a walkway. I was hoping by forcing guests around a long walkway, it would tire them out and make them more likely to buy drinks or food from one of my stands, thus increasing the park's profits. The other reason was that by having a long path, it will spread people out more, making them less likely to notice the protesters at the zoo. Unfortunately, this failed tremendously. The animals began getting diseases, and I can't cure them because the vets will also feed them while they cure them. On top of that, without a keeper, the cages were filling with poop, which caused even more disease and more protesters to arrive. That large walkway I built, it ended up just making people upset they couldn't see the animals. Granted, they could have just moved 2 feet and they would see them just fine, but they didn't feel like doing that. And for the cherry on top, the heat from the desert just pissed everyone off instead of creating a convincing environment. It wasn't long before animals started dying, and without any way to secure even a scrap of funding, the anti-food zoo sadly fell into ruin. I encountered a lot of obstacles during this that I'm gonna have to figure out how to overcome, but I also learned a lot, and my next zoo, the Starvation Zoo, would overcome all of it and truly be a success. This time, I made my zoo in a tropical location for one specific reason. Think about it. What animals do people care about the least? Snakes. They're all scaly and mean, and nobody likes them. So I would fill my zoo with snakes. Unfortunately, there aren't actually snakes in the default game, so I went with the next best thing, crocodiles. Crocodiles have tons of advantages for this challenge that I'll get into as they come up. I created a large pond for them to live in, with an island in the middle. I put down a small wooden shelter for them at the back of the exhibit. To save money, I moved trees that already existed on the map to the enclosure area and the zoo to serve as decoration and give the crocodiles a more suitable habitat. I actually put effort into making their enclosures suitable for them this time around, as I learned by doing so they can go hungry for a while without the protesters considering it animal abuse. Instead of just filling the enclosure with tall grass, I put in some soil, rock, and short grass. I even spent a full $2,000 for a water purifier so they don't drink dirty water. I know, I'm practically a saint. I once again made the path loop around the entire enclosure and added some food and drink vendors for guests along with basic amenities like ATMs and bathrooms. And of course, plenty of do not feed signs. But there was one big difference between this zoo and the previous one, and that was the donation bin in front of the crocodile enclosure. When people like the zoo, they toss incredulous amounts of money into this thing for absolutely no reason. This bin would be the primary source of income for my zoo, since with only a few animals, I would barely be able to get people through the gates, let alone charge them money for it. Finally, I purchased my first 2 crocodiles, Sri and Murni. Immediately, the game flooded me with alerts that I wouldn't be able to care for them without a keeper or vet, but that was all part of the plan. Soon after the zoo opened, I added a Nile monitor lizard to the enclosure since it also liked the same habitat in the hopes they could all be friends. They seemed to get along well, and the 3 of them hung out having a good time. With the zoo opened, everything was going decently well. The enclosure I made was a bit too large, causing guests to have trouble seeing the animals. I simply shrunk both the path and the enclosure, and everything seemed to be going swimmingly. I did run into a small hiccup though. Sri the crocodile got a bit hangry and did end up murdering the Nile monitor lizard I'd purchased about 5 minutes after getting him, but surprisingly, they didn't actually eat the body and just left it there floating in the water. Either way, this was probably the smartest thing they could have done because it didn't take long for the corpse to gross out guests and attract protesters. One problem was followed closely by another, because it wasn't long after that both crocodiles entered full-blown starvation. But I had a genius solution. fine. Just sell them. These two had survived for almost 2 years without food, which is probably how long real crocodiles can survive without food or something. So, by simply boxing them up and selling them, I could buy a new crocodile and keep being profitable. This way, I would even make some of the money back from buying the crocodile instead of losing all that value when it dies. Somewhat surprisingly, this plan actually worked for a little while. I got a new crocodile named Basuki who lived for a few years before being traded out for a new animal. This time, a croc named Ramelan. I even gave Ramelan a friend named Kushi. Kushi was a gharial. What's a gharial? It's like a slightly smaller crocodile with a long snout for eating fish. It's not important. Kushi the gharial immediately caught a life-threatening disease, and herein lies the problem with my strategy. Once an animal gets sick, I don't have a vet, so I can't cure it. This means I have to pay a fine whenever an inspector comes around. But more importantly, when an animal is sick, I can't sell it. This causes protesters to arrive once the disease gets life-threatening, but even more important than that, visitors will not donate to the bin while an animal is sick, meaning I'm stuck with an unprofitable zoo for the rest of that animal's life, which even with a deadly disease can be multiple years. I was worried about how few guests my zoo was bringing in, so to boost interest, I purchased a very large crocodile named Agus, and the very first thing Agus did was murder Kushi. I do not know why he did that, but he did me a favor in the process, because that diseased gharial cost me thousands of dollars and sent the zoo spiraling into the red for a full year. Even with Kushi dead, the damage had already been done. It had been 7 years at this point, and the crocodile habitat had not been cleaned once. And there were still 2 corpses in it. There was still no way for me to clean it without the keeper automatically feeding the crocodiles. None of this would have been a problem if it weren't for that damn gharial. That thing pooped so much more than any other animal I've had up until this, and as a result, the enclosure was filled with feces. It was so dirty, the crocodiles were at such a high risk of disease, they would attract protesters whether I fed them or not. Out of desperation, I sold Agus and got one more crocodile named Adelia, and within only a few months, she contracted a deadly disease. It seemed the zoo was doomed. The sanitation nightmare seemed irreparable, and it looked as if there were more protesters than guests. Each inspection would come with more and more fines, causing me to sink deeper and deeper into the red. But then, I had an idea. If there aren't any animals in the zoo, the keeper wouldn't feed any animals, right? Adelia had miraculously recovered from her illness, so I sold her. As the zoo was empty, I hired a keeper to clean the poop and a vet to remove the corpses, which at this point were just bones. Was I still selling tickets to guests at this point? Yes, I was. Did this upset them? Yes, but public opinion was already at an all-time low, so I just took the cash and ran. Once the enclosure had been cleaned, I fired both the keeper and the vet only a week after they were hired without giving them even a day's notice. I promptly purchased a new crocodile, this time a female named Kandra. Kandra was fantastic. She didn't get sick, and she brought in plenty of lovely guests to the park. She even collected almost $6,000 worth of donations in just a couple years' time. In hindsight, that is not a lot of money, but I was desperate, alright? Everything was going as well as I could have hoped. I kept cycling out crocodiles, and to avoid having to hire keepers again, I only kept one at a time. This did lower how many people were interested in my park, but it prevented the poop buildup that happened last time, so I think it was worth it. Despite my efforts to keep the place clean, I would still get diseased crocodiles every now and then. Whenever that happened, I would just let them starve to death or die of the disease before purchasing another. I just couldn't risk bringing in another crocodile only for it to also catch the disease. This did cause the public opinion of my zoo to completely tank, since at this point, I was just a guy charging money for people to look at the dying crocodile I was holding captive in my backyard. At this point, I think the only remaining guests were only here because of the terrible treatment of the crocs, so I guess it worked out in the end. It seemed I'd finally found a sustainable cycle. Get a croc, it starts starving, I sell it and replace it. Slowly but surely, I crossed over the $100,000 threshold after 23 years of running my zoo. Somehow, through all that, I managed to create a sustainable business model in Planet Zoo without ever feeding a single animal. Thank you for watching, and subscribe for more stuff like this in the future.